Hello, everyone, and welcome to Theology Class with Mr. Betz. Today's class will be focused on the Sacrament of Holy Orders, ordination, in our section on the Sacraments of Vocation or Service. So if you'd like to follow along, the class notes have been posted on PowerSchool, and I will also be screen sharing the notes with you so you can follow along. You might want to have a notebook out to jot down some notes, as you'll see some of this content on a quiz at the end of the week. And feel free to write with any questions or stop by for office hours if you have questions. I hope you are all doing well. I look forward to this time together. And without further ado, let's get started. All right. So the Sacrament of Holy Orders, last week we talked about the Sacrament of Marriage and tried to take you through the briefly through a history of marriage and some takes on the theology behind the sacrament. Of the 7 sacraments, it's most likely that a lot of you will end up getting married. And statistically, a lot of you will actually end up getting married in a Catholic church if you identify as Catholic, and even marrying other people that are Catholic. But I think just as many of you should consider vocations to religious life, to ordained life, and that's through the Sacrament of Holy Orders. And I suppose I'll start this class a little more personally, just because I think you should know that most folks, at least in the St. Ignatius High School Theology Department, considered a vocation to religious life at some point. And many of us even went on silent discernment retreats. I went on a 7-day silent retreat in the Detroit province, as did many other folks I know in the department, considering seriously a calling to religious life. So when we teach on this topic, just like marriage, we're teaching somewhat from experience, people that have actually studied it and thought about, being called to it, and if called to it, thought about saying yes to it. So it's a beautiful sacrament. It's an important sacrament. And I want to follow up from last week in our class. We defined vocation, and a lot of time on Ignatian discernment. I think it's a content that'll help you in the rest of your life, whether it's for sports, for the arts, for dating, relationships, where you live, what job you take. Discernment's going to be important. And the idea that you have vocations in life, not just jobs, not just contracts, but vocations, is really important, central to all of this. So I want to start this class this week off with this question. What do you think of the word vocation? What comes to mind? And it may seem like a repeat from last week, but it's truly not. When you think of vocation, I want you to think of the famous statement that Father Welsh made. He was the president when I was a student at Ignatius, and really one of the most remarkable presidents we've had at St. Ignatius. We've had a lot of remarkable men run this place. And Father Bob Welsh, class 54, said, and it's still on our campus, the purpose of our education, or a Jesuit education, is to give a young man the tools whereby he can answer the question, what does God want from me? What does God want from me? I want this question to frame our class today, because if you think of marriage or holy orders as just a job or a thing that you do, it's not going to be fulfilling. It may not bring you joy, and it actually might make you unhappy. If you think of marriage or holy orders as a response to God's question of come follow me or come and see, totally different experience. In fact, life-giving. When you answer that question, it's truly, for Christians, it's the meaning to life. It's figuring out what that question is from God, or questions, and then how to say yes. With Mary, we celebrate her yes. Even with Jesus, the Son, to God the Father, we celebrate his yes. Yeses aren't always easy, but they do often bring joy. And I think if you had gotten to know Father Welsh, you would have known joy. And all of the Jesuits on campus, when you get to know them, you know joy. And even we have a deacon on campus, Deacon Dan Gala, joy. Like their faith is alive. It's a gift that they've been grateful to receive, and they just want to live it. So the positive intensity and the joy that comes with saying yes to God. What does God want for me? And our job at Ignatius, we see it as giving you the tools to make those decisions. We don't want you to all be cookie cutters of one another or of us. We want you to have the right tools to say yes to your specific call. And I believe that everyone who's watching this right now, that you have a specific, unique calling from God. That's pretty miraculous. And then when you say yes, well, sky's the limit, certainly. So Pope Francis has been speaking a lot on vocations recently. And I found a quote from him just this year. This might have been just a couple months ago, actually. He said, "Every vocation is born of that gaze of love with which the Lord came to meet us, perhaps even at a time when our boat was being battered by the storm." In this current time of challenges, this lecture is being given during COVID-19 and quarantine. Certainly the boat's being battered, right? There is, without a doubt, a storm. Pretty serious one that's taken a lot of lives and frustrated a lot of people and changed literally everything that we know in terms of our day-to-day. And yet vocations won't stop. That gaze of love from God, that's the constant. Like if everything else is changing in the world, that gaze of love is constant to meet us, to be with us. I like the way Pope Francis characterizes concepts because he understands theology, certainly, but he grounds it in a very simple human way that we understand the gaze of love. If you've ever fallen in love with someone or, been loved by a parent or guardian or teammate or something, that power of someone looking at you and saying, like, I really care about you, it's powerful, strong. And so Francis is saying that that's really what a vocation is. So how do you discern it? Last week was really, we spent a lot of time on that, but this is going to be focused on holy orders. How do you discern that you're called to religious life? Here are some tips. Okay, and this first is from Pope Francis again. He said, and I quote, "Your own personal vocation does not consist only in the work you do, though that is an expression of it. Your vocation is something more. It's a path guiding your many efforts and actions towards service to others. Finding one's vocation has nothing to do with inventing ourselves or creating ourselves out of nothing. It has to do with finding our true selves in the light of God and letting our lives flourish and bear fruit." Pope Francis goes on in this article to talk about, the best way to minister to those who are not believers is not first to hit them with a bunch of truths and arguments, but to live your life in such a way that you believe that you found yourself in the Lord and that the Lord helped you become the best version of yourself. And it's not just the work you do, it's how you express who you are. And people will be curious about that. People will follow that. And I firmly believe that that's true. I can make all the arguments logically for why I think God exists and why I think the Catholic Church is important and essential and contains the truths of our faith. But really, the point is to live it. At the end of the day, I'm going to let God take care of a lot of the rest of it. But if we live it, and a lot of you guys really already do through all your service work and your faith commitments and mass attendance and prayer, but if we live it, right, let God's life flourish in our life, we're going to bear fruit. And that's the key. That's discipleship, right? So to follow up on the Ignatian discernment tools from last week, there are kind of three senses of vocations, or three levels, if you will, of vocations. And the first, and this is the most important, and it's related to your homework this week, that there's a universal call to holiness. That comes from a document called Lumen Gentium, one of the 16 documents from Vatican II, but it's been essential in the gospel since the beginning that we are all called to be holy. We're all called to be, and in Matthew, it says, I think, perfect. We're called to strive to be perfect. We're not going to be perfect, but to be saints. And saints were holy men and women separated for God, that did extraordinary things with ordinary lives. That call, that vocation never changes. We are all called to holiness. And we're called to reach out to each other when that's not happening, or to reach out to each other in gratitude when it is happening. The second sense of vocation is this personal kind of becoming who God wants you to be. And that's kind of where these classes the last 2 weeks have focused on. You might be called to marriage and to raising a family, or to being open to a family at the very least, to priesthood, religious life, or to some kind of consecrated single life. Those are really the three options. And it's complicated, right? I mean, if I'm being honest, I could see myself being married and being called to some kind of ordained religious life. Luckily, there is an option for that. And we'll talk about the diaconate later. But after 10 years of married life, married men can consider that call. And but it's tough because you can see yourself often as being a married man or one, and being a father or a mother. But you can also see yourself being a minister. And I would say that my unique role as a theology teacher allows me to do both, right? I get to be married, I get to raise a family, and I have essentially a lot of the same training as a priest would have. In fact, I went to school with priests in formation for a couple of years, and then did further graduate work with more folks that were in formation. So in a lot of ways, we've run parallel roads. We just ended up in different places because of God's vocations for us. And then there's also the option of consecrated single life, that some folks are called to remain single, and that might be in some kind of like as a religious, as a nun or a brother, or it could just be as a single person. And then the third sense of vocation, probably what you're most thinking about right now, is what does God call me to today, to this week? And there's no magic formula for this. I don't think priests or deacons or brothers or nuns have it more figured out. They do have often a little more training and practice in it. But knowing what we're going to do day to day. How am I going to be a son? How am I going to be a brother? How am I going to be a teammate? These are all vocational questions that you can hopefully use the content from last week to start answering. Okay, so I mentioned this before, the common vocation of all Christians. I really want you to remember this, because we're all called to be priestly, prophetic, and kingly in a way. This universal call to holiness, to love and live the gospel. We're called to love and live truth. I feel like I should just hit stop recording and that's it. Matthew 5:48. Try and be perfect. Do the best you can. Be the best son. Be the best athlete. The best musician you can. Give yourself some space to fail. It's okay to do so, but to try and be holy, to be separated for God, not to be holier than thou. We're not better than anyone else, but to acknowledge that universal call. I think a lot of folks probably ignore vocations because they don't see this first step as applying to everybody. The people in the pews are called to be holy, just like the priest on the altar. We're in this together. So that universal call, I linked this on the notes, Vatican II and Lumen Gentium, is a really important thing, especially for all those like myself who will remain a lay person, most likely, and not necessarily be ordained, to keep in mind that we are all called. As Catholics, we claim in this document, and certainly it's true, not unlike our Protestant brothers and sisters, that we are called to be priestly, prophetic, and kingly. Now, when I say you're called to be a priest, it doesn't mean necessarily an ordained priest, although that may be true for some of you. And right now, as I speak, I wonder if a few of you are thinking, I've never thought about this, but maybe this would be good. Maybe God's calling me to this. Sharing in that mission of Jesus Christ, though, is for all of us. And then specifically, some of you are going to be called to religious life. I remember in high school being asked to go on a retreat that we still offer. That's essentially a vocation discernment retreat. We offered it around Easter time, my junior or senior year. I think I went on it to see if we had some kind of inkling of a call. And we have a whole group at Ignatius that focuses on reaching out to guys that might feel like they have a call and working with them. And you might be one of those guys. Hold on to that. It's not weird. It's important, it's essential to the faith, and God may be calling you. And what a remarkable life. I'm still friends with so many priests I knew in training, priests I knew before they entered, and some of the best men I know, hands down, period. And I'll talk about a few of them at the end of this lecture, so I can introduce you at least digitally to them. Normally we do things in class, video chats and such, but that's probably not going to happen this time around with COVID. So this role of priesthood, right? Jesus is the intermediary between God and people. Like God sends God's Son, and Jesus is the perfect mediator. And we talked in this class, the Sacraments class, first unit, about mediating the divine. Priests are teachers, they're preachers, they sanctify things, they make things holy. We literally, at least in the Catholic Church, cannot have Eucharist without priest. So while we're all called to be priestly, the ordained priesthood is different, and it's important, and it's essential. The priest is the caretaker or minister to the ministers, serving in structured ministries, and leads a church or kind of a special ministry, maybe not always a parish, to serve others. I mean, what a remarkable job to say, when I get up every morning, my job is to be a model Christian, to show people Christ, and to help people serve. Cat for the rest of your life, essentially, you know? That's pretty remarkable. I don't know if you've ever been to an ordination. The likelihood is not. At some point in your life, I do hope you get to one. What a powerful experience. To see the men, this is the part where they lay prostrate at the altar. There's another point where the laying on of hands. Every priest that's at the ordination will lay on his hands after the bishop of the man or men who are being ordained. It's remarkable. So it's through the Sacrament of Holy Orders that men become entrusted to the apostles and become priests. And there are 3 degrees of holy orders. There are 3 kind of levels of ordination. You can be ordained a deacon, which you could be married or not married, and I'll talk about that later. You could be ordained a priest. Can't be married if you're a Roman Catholic priest. And you could be ordained a bishop. Same deal. You can't be married if you're a bishop. But they all have their unique roles, and so I'm going to go through those in a moment here. So in terms of holy orders, you know, there are tons of biblical roots for it in the Old Testament, in Hebrew Scripture, and in the New Testament. First of all, Exodus 19, verse 6, Yahweh talks about a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, that the nation can and should be led by these folks that are sacramentally ordained to lead. Aaron and Melchizedek are 2 famous Old Testament priests. And then in the New Testament, you have a number of different scenes, like the laying on of hands in 2 Timothy. We still do that today for confirmation and for ordination, laying on of hands, because Jesus touched to heal. So too, we believe that bishops, and that's Pope Francis there, right? The Pope is just the Bishop of Rome, not just, but he's not like a higher level bishop. He's a bishop of Rome, which has typically been elevated to the chair of Peter, so that's why it has a little more gravitas. And 1 Timothy talks about the order of bishops. We certainly know in the earliest church that there were groups of bishops that led church communities. And then in Titus in the New Testament, we have priests in Crete, which is in modern-day Greece, and so we have priests and bishops from a very early time. So essentially what I'm saying is holy orders has been in the tradition for a long time. And while the church came before the Bible, right, the Bible is like the church's book, there's certainly evidence for what the church is doing in the Bible, in the Catholic Church. So this is our now former Cleveland bishop, Bishop Nelson Perez. He's now the Archbishop of Philadelphia. But the role of the bishop is, I guess you could say, an elevated priesthood. It's high priesthood. It's the fullness of the sacrament, because a bishop can perform all 7 sacraments, right? And The one sacrament that a bishop can do that no one else can do is ordain. So we need bishops to ordain more priests, right? The job of the bishop is to teach or to rule, to shepherd. He is typically seen as the father of the diocese. If a priest is the kind of father of a parish, just like a husband or wife is the leader, the priestly role in the home, the domestic church, you ramp it up. The priest is in charge of the parish and the bishop is in charge of the diocese. So all seven sacraments the bishop can perform. The priests, the role of the priest is similar to a bishop, right? He's a co-worker with the bishop. This is an important phrase that I will ask you about. He acts in persona Christi. So in the Catholic Church, and this is really true for all Christian communities, I think, the priest is meant to model Christ in the person of Christ. They are not Christ. Priests are human beings, so are bishops. And we certainly should avoid things like clericalism and worshiping priests or worshiping bishops. That's not the call. But they are meant to model Christ for us. I mean, they literally give up their lives and dedicate it to that task. They preach, they pastor, they lead a community. They can perform 5 of the 7 sacraments. And I grabbed a picture here of a good friend of mine, a guy who went into formation right around the time that I did. We were on the same discernment retreat to become priests. And now he is Father Cyril Pinchak, Society of Jesus. He's actually bi-ritual, so he's a Byzantine Catholic. And he's going to be coming back to St. Ignatius to teach in our department, which is really exciting. Right now he's in Rome studying, doing more work. He's an Ohio boy born and bred. He went to John Carroll. He was All-American, I think, runner. Certainly pretty respectable runner at the college level. Has his pilot's license. Really cool guy. Anyone in our Ignatius community, you're going to love getting to know him. But that's Father Cyril Pinchak. He is a Jesuit priest by ritual, the Byzantine rite. And then finally the diaconate. And offer a little Ned Flanders here for Deacon Dan Galla. What a rock star. Has been Deacon Dan Galla for as long as I've known him. He was at Ignatius when I was a student. And he's a good example of one way that you can become a deacon, which is after you get married. Deacons are ordained to service. They're not priests, but they are ordained. And we know there have been deacons in the very early church. We have scriptural evidence of the diaconate. So that's why we have bishop, priest, deacon, because in the very early church, all 3 of those roles existed. Although the bishops and deacons may have existed before the presbyter or the priest, but they all existed. Deacons assist at liturgies. They distribute communion at Mass. They can't say Mass. They can't preside or consecrate at the Eucharist, but they can certainly distribute communion. They go to the sick. They preach the gospel. They're allowed to preach on the gospel. They can bless marriages and baptisms. As you know, the couple for a marriage is the primary minister. So deacons can be present if a priest can't be present. They can perform baptisms and they can preside at funerals. So a lot of what happens at a Catholic church are marriages, baptisms, and funerals. And the deacon can do all of those things. So I guess, just a plug here, if you are on fire for your faith or end up in your later years after college really being on fire for your faith, but you feel a call to marriage, there's still a possibility of you serving in a very specific capacity in the ordained ministry of the church, and that's through the diaconate. All right, so I have a number of videos that I would normally show you if we were in class in person, but we're not. So I'm going to skip through this video, this Sacraments 101. This is from a website called Busted Halo, and I think I've mentioned it before. They do great short snippets on all things really Christian and Catholic. And if you ever need a short snippet on something, if you're like, gosh, what is X all about? Or your youth group needs it, or you become a youth minister someday, Busted Halo is going to be a great resource for you, among others. So how is Holy Orders celebrated? The specific aspects of the rite. So just like marriage and baptism and most other sacraments, we like to celebrate it within the Mass, within a Eucharist. The difference with Holy Orders is you have to have a bishop present. And ideally, ordination happens on a Sunday. And that's usually how it's scheduled. They happen every year because we have new guys getting ordained every year. There are two essential signs or symbols in the sacrament, and that's the laying on of hands on the head of the ordained and the prayer of consecration. Those are two essential moments in the sacrament. Candidates are called by name after the Liturgy of the Word, so like marriage, this happens between Liturgy of the Word and Liturgy of the Eucharist. They're asked if they're willing to serve God's people. The bishop questions the candidates about their willingness to share in the care of God's people, and this is all scripted. It's not like made up. The bishop has a text in front of him. And then the ordination itself happens, the laying on of hands and prayer. The priest's hands are anointed with oils. The vestments, the chalice with water and wine, and the paten are all given to the priest. And sometimes I've seen at ordinations where the parents of the man being ordained will put on his vestments, which is just so powerful. It's like, we brought you into this world, and now we're essentially clothing you with these vestments that are now giving you to the service of the church and to God. And it's not a sad moment. In fact, one of my friends, Father Michael Rossman, I'll show you a short clip from him in a moment. He said many people think it's sad. It's like, parents are losing their son. But he phrases it differently. He says, no, their son is gaining more family. And it's all about how you frame the call. And if you ever get to meet Father Michael Rossman, which I hope you do someday, you'd believe it. He's not like a sad priest. He's not unsure about his vocation. He's joyful. So priests are called to be celibate, which simply means, that they refrain from marriage and sexual intercourse, among other things. Why? Well, a number of reasons. First of all, just off the script here, speaking as a dad to be a full-time minister and a full-time husband and a full-time father, something would give. I mean, even now, I express frustration on a regular basis that I can't go out on more CAT activities. It's a personal struggle of mine because CAT didn't exist when I was at Ignatius, but certainly the Arupe program existed, and I served through the Arupe program. I tutored, I helped the summer camp, and I found my joy and my passion in service. And being a husband and a dad right now, I just have less time for that. And that's just the way it needs to be. But it's hard. And so I'm just naming that as honest because priests say, listen, if I give up, not because I'm not attracted to, to a woman to have a family or something, but if I give that up, I will literally have more time and freedom to serve Christ and others. It's true. There's no other way to say it. I think you could do it all pretty well, especially if your partner was pretty understanding and maybe didn't have a job. But especially if both people in a family, both adults are working, that freedom's hard to come by. So one, celibacy because they have more freedom to serve Christ. Two, giving up a family is a concrete witness to the sacrifice that Jesus asked for. It's not that they're not called to be family people, and it's not that they're not called to be intimate with folks. I think if you see a priest and after this lecture, you might have a little more respect for them in the sense of, I'm giving this up as a sacrifice. I could be a good dad, but I'm going to do something else because I'm called to it, and it gives me joy. By living as a celibate person who's in love with Christ, the priest is kind of pointing us to the eternal life, where we believe there won't be like marriages. You'll be united with your partner if you're married in heaven, certainly. But this union with God is like a whole other level of union. So it's hard to explain, but they're modeling in some ways what it might be like after death. And finally, we don't believe that Jesus was married. We have no evidence of his being married. It seems like he would have wanted to be married. He was any Jewish male, you got married in Jesus's time. Like, that's just it. But if he intentionally gave that up, the question is why? And it might be for this universal love, not to dedicate yourself to one particular love, but to dedicate yourself to loving all. Interestingly enough, in the Eastern tradition, so the Great Schism that happened in the 11th century, essentially, that tradition allows married priesthood. although their bishops aren't married, they're celibate. But there are different versions of this that have come out, and we'll talk about the history of marriage and how priests in the past were married and then chose to become celibate. And actually, the first people that we think were intentionally celibate in the church were actually lay people. So we've actually reversed the trajectory, but that's okay. Doctrine, develops over time, and the understanding of the role of holy orders has developed over time. So to that end, like I said, celibacy especially, because that's usually the big question I get in class is, how could you give up sex, or how could you give up being intimate in that way with other people? It actually began as a lay movement, as like a person like me saying, I'm not ordained, but I'm going to give that up. And this is as early as the 300s. We have evidence of lay people saying, I want to dedicate my life to Christ, and so this is what I'm going to do. St. Anthony of Egypt actually comes to mind. He's the first Catholic monk that I guess we would see as like intentionally giving up his sexual desires in order to serve Christ. And priests were initially married. I don't know if that shocks you or not, but in the earliest of churches, priests were allowed to be married. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that, as the monastic life developed, and the monastic life, monks really changed things in the sense that we were getting some men who felt called to priesthood and some men that didn't, that just want to remain brothers or monks. And the men that felt called to priesthood, coming from the monasteries, they were living in community. And the monasteries was the first time where we said, let's all live in community together and share work duties and share money and share property. This hadn't been done before. Well, once those men felt called to get married and got married, now they had presumably wives and children in the monastery, and it just didn't work. What happens if your kids get older and they're not called to priesthood? Usually you would give your kids some money, some inheritance. Well, does that come from the community? And what about the guys that aren't married? It just got to be too complicated. And so by the 12th century, the church put celibacy into canon law, really as a function of the role of priesthood, that it needed to be so. And even to this day, at least diocesan priests, they can own their own property and own their own homes and own, cars. Some of the orders, like religious orders, like the Society of Jesus or the Franciscans and Benedictines and Dominicans, they don't own anything. They take a vow of poverty. Usually diocesan priests will take a vow of charity, but it's a little more optional. And anyway, so religious orders, if you were to be called one day to become a Jesuit or a Franciscan, you would literally own nothing. You'd all of those men would have to be celibate, but there are different kind of trajectories or tracks for the different orders. So I wanted to offer you this image, and I got this image from a coworker, just to I want to stir the pot a little bit to show you that we've changed a lot over the years. My mother grew up in she was born in a pre-Vatican II Roman Catholicism. Vatican II happening 1962 to 65-ish. And this is how we thought about vocations and religious life in the past, right? You'll notice at the very head is Christ, the most important vocation, right? And then Mary, who said yes to Jesus. And then Peter, who said yes to Jesus after turning away from Jesus. And then the Pope, and then priests, and then sisters, and then brothers, and then the father, the mother, the boy, and at the very end, the girl. So this idea of a hierarchy of vocations, that while there might be a universal call to holiness, it's way less impactful and important if you're a girl versus being Mary, or if you're a boy versus being a priest. I wonder what you think about this image and what comments or thoughts come to mind. And you could certainly post those comments as one of your 321 connections. Suffice to say, we see things very differently in 2020. And Lumen Gentium, chapter 5, and Matthew 5, and the universal call to holiness would essentially make this pretty equal footing, aside from Christ, that the rest of us are all human. And we are all called to serve God, and that our vocations may be different, that is, a mother or a father or a brother or a sister or a priest, and yet we're all called to serve Christ. And even St. Peter and every pope we've ever had and Mary, they were human beings, right? And while they had unique calls and they rose to the occasion, the idea is that you and I, we have the same calls and that Christ is calling us in different ways. The importance is that we answer the call. It's not, how high up are we in the food chain of religious life? So this idea of holy orders is a sacrament of vocation. It's a sacrament of service. And I really want to emphasize that. They are called to be in the person of Christ, in persona Christi. So as we believe Christ lived and worked and was, we want the priest to try and model that as much as possible without obviously being without sin. Priests are sinners. Popes are sinners. All saints are sinners. The famous line, all saints have a past and all sinners have a future, is really true. But priests are consecrated in Christ's name to feed the church by word and grace. To feed the church. That's the catechism. A priest's job is to feed. If you think about Labra on Sunday nights, the priest in that role is serving all of us who are on the proverbial streets, who are, quote unquote, homeless or without guidance sometimes. That's what a true priest does. And the common priesthood is that universal call. That's all of us. We all are called to the common priesthood versus the ministerial priesthood for everybody. For ordained folks. So the presbyterate, that's the name of the sacrament of ordination, that is priesthood. We already went through a lot of this, but some additional notes I had here. In the Old Testament, you have additionally the tribe of Levi. They were typically seen as the priestly tribe, the Levitical. That's why the whole book of Leviticus, if you remember from freshman year, is a lot of rules and regulations and guidelines, which may seem boring to read, but they were essential for the priestly class to do things properly from the Jewish perspective, so that they got the sacrifices right, so that the ritual was properly done. In the New Testament, we have the apostles, certainly who were sent by Jesus to do all the things that Jesus had done, to exorcise demons, to heal, to baptize. Okay. The episcopate is the fancy term for the role of the bishops, and they are meant to be the guider of the flock, really, the defenders of the church. We see bishops as successors to the apostles. So when we say we are one holy Catholic and apostolic means we're trying to follow in the tradition of the apostles. And for more on that, you could look up the Petrine theory from the Bishop of Rome. But that's really where we get the whole role of the chair of Peter, of the Pope. Not some weird clandestine thing. We think the apostles passed down the tradition. We're trying to follow it. That's the Catholic Church. They're meant to be bishops, the spiritual father of a diocese, and to ordain priests, right? And the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, appoints bishops. So, for example, in Cleveland right now, we're waiting for a new appointment, and that'll be up to officially Pope Francis to give us a new bishop. So hopefully that happens soon in 2020 here. And then the diaconate. I just want to make this slide to explain the difference between the transitional diaconate and the permanent diaconate. So a lot of my buddies that were in training to become priests, one of the last phases of training before you get ordained a priest is you get ordained a deacon. And that's called the transitional diaconate for obvious reasons, because all those deacons are going to become priests. But they receive the diaconate ordination first, which is really kind of cool. At the last stage of training, usually the guys are in grad school. They'll do 2 years of the same degree that I did, the Master's of Theological Studies, or 3 years, the Master of Divinity, and then they'll get ordained to the diaconate. Now that's different than the permanent diaconate. If you're not going to go beyond the diaconate, that is, if you're already married, you can get ordained to the office of the permanent diaconate. If you're a lay person, that is, if you're unmarried and you're not ordained, if you're just not ordained, I should say, and you get ordained a deacon, you cannot get married in the Catholic Church. So the men who are seminarians, if they get ordained to the diaconate, they can't get married in the Catholic Church, which makes sense because they're going to become priests. But if I were to become a deacon, I'm married. If I were to become a deacon, I can remain married, right? So you could be married and then become a deacon. You can't become a deacon and then get married. You got to wait 10 years. I think I mentioned this. You don't get paid unless you have some kind of role at the church beyond being a deacon. So all those deacons at your parishes, if you know them, people like Deacon Dan Gala, he doesn't get paid by St. Charles to be a deacon. He gets paid by St. Ignatius to be a teacher, but deacons can do a lot. They can baptize, distribute communion, preach the gospel, conduct marriages, funerals. They can proclaim the gospel, so they can read the gospel as well. But they can't ordain, and they can't perform the Eucharist, consecrate. 3 evangelical vows: chastity, obedience, and poverty. Or if you're a diocesan priest, charity. Chastity essentially means being celibate, and celibacy or chastity is different for every person, right? I'm called to be chaste as a married man. You're called to be chaste as a single man, or if you're watching this, a single woman. Chastity applies to all of us, and it doesn't mean always being celibate, but it means proper use of our sexual function incorporated into our whole selves. See Theology of the Body for more on that. But chastity honors the deeper meaning of sexuality, and for a priest, that means giving it up, and that's not easy. But how remarkable to give it up for others. Obedience, for example, Jesuits take a vow of obedience to the Pope. Diocesan priests take a vow of obedience to the bishop, and eventually, essentially, to the Pope. But and then poverty or charity is that you don't own any material goods. For Jesuits, at least I can speak on their behalf, they own nothing. They have credit cards that aren't in their name. They have cars they drive that aren't in their name. They don't have their own bank accounts. They give up everything at the service of Christ, which is just a remarkable thing. So, gosh, I don't know if I want to take the time to show you all these videos, but I'll show you some clips. I want to see if this works. Father Michael Peruccio is a diocesan priest. I wanted to show you a guy who answered the call, and his takeaway from this short video clip is that discernment means listening to God's call. And you'll see in his life, he didn't know even in college right away that this was going to be his thing. Check it out. And so, Father Michael Prucho, a number of things. One, listening to God's call and then being willing to be used as an instrument to serve God. Really grounded guy, and from med school to priesthood, essentially, or thinking about med school to priesthood. The next person I wanted to introduce to you is Father Michael Rossman. I first met Father Michael Rossman in Africa. I got to travel with a Jesuit high school I taught at twice to Africa with students to do a Kairos, to get to know Loyola High School in Dar es Salaam. And Father Michael Rossman, Notre Dame grad. I think he was a valedictorian, actually. Remarkable guy, grounded, down to earth, super honest, Midwest guy from Iowa. Just showed me the passion of vocation, and so I wanted to let you meet him. This is a very short clip where Jesuits talk about what they love about their vocation. So here you go. So the concept there of increasing your family when you answer a vocational call to priesthood, religious life, not losing it. Um, how great to just increase your family like that. And if you get to know St. Ignatius High School and the community that is ours, you'll start to feel that. Maybe you have a call to increase your family. Father James Martin, a similar narrative about the gift of community. He talks about many things he's most grateful for, and one of them is his Jesuit brothers and all the joy and fun and family that really exists in that community. And I've actually been to his community. I've met him in New York City. They just live really holy, extraordinary lives, but also grounded, down to earth lives. It's remarkable. Many of these men are in the top of their field, publishing and lecturing and serving, and yet they're grounded. They have meals together and they hang out. And our community at St. Ignatius in Cleveland is the same way. Down to earth men doing extraordinary things. So finally, one of the men that were at my wedding on the altar with me as a priest is Father Brian Christopher. The other two, Father Richard Lennon, who's a professor at Boston College, and Father Gia, who's the president of Ignatius. Brian Christopher, a great friend of mine. We went to grad school together. We had classes together, played music together, and he is now serving, and has for a while, a community in Belize. He did a lot of anti-gang work in Belize, working with youth. He's now the pastor and leader of a parish, St. Martin de Porres Parish. So much to say about Brian, but here I just wanted you to meet him for a second to talk about jumping in and getting creative, and how the priesthood and religious life is often about jumping in and getting creative. If you're one of those guys, you may be called to this life. So that's Brian, Father Brian Christopher. And I don't know. I thought no better way to end this class today than to introduce you to a couple of really friends who have answered the call. So this is going to conclude our class on the Sacrament of Holy Orders. Hopefully you've learned a little bit more about the practical details and also the big picture understanding why we have the sacrament, what the ritual is all about, and maybe a thought about your own call. There's another video posted on the class Power School page called Fishers of Men. That's another vocational video. Keep in mind you need to do a 3-2-1, 3 facts you learned today, 2 connections between the facts, and 1 question or idea that you have about the content. And know that you'll have a quiz at the end of the week on Friday on this material. Thanks for watching. Thanks for taking notes. And certainly hope that you're doing well. Have a good week. And this is Mr. Betz of the St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland Theology Department signing off. Be well, be good, and do good. And we will see you next time. Be well.